Good afternoon. This is Catherine Klein with the National Regulatory Research Institute, and I wanted to welcome you to today's webinar on delinquencies and disconnections. Where are we now? This webinar is the first in a series hosted by the NARUC Committee on Consumers and the Public Interest, the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates, and the National Regulatory Research Institute on the topic of data collection for utility disconnections and delinquencies. The purpose of this series is to gain a greater understanding of the utility and state agency data collection processes around the country and to make recommendations for a consistent data collection and reporting model. Today's webinar, which is the first in this series, will share up-to-date information from experts in the field to help regulators and staff better understand how utility disconnections impact customers, what information is currently being collected, and how is this information being used. This webinar will focus on framing the challenges of disconnection and delinquencies for the larger webinar series. Before we jump into the webinar, I'd like to provide a few housekeeping notes. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please go to the questions box on your GoToMeeting toolbar and submit any questions there. The intention for this webinar is to allow participants to engage with the panelists through the questions box, so please take full advantage of this tool. Our plan is to allow panelists to field questions after every section. Because this webinar is the first in our series, feel free to ask bigger and broader questions as well. If we can't fit questions in today, they will help to shape our next webinars and ensure that we're addressing important topics related to delinquencies and disconnections. Finally, before I hand things over, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's panel, the Honorable Marion S. Gold, PhD, Commissioner from the Rhode Island Public Utilities Commission. Commissioner Gold was appointed to the Rhode Island PUC by Governor Gina Raimondo in June of 2016. Commissioner Gold has previously served as Commissioner of the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources. Prior to joining the OER, she was the Director of the Extension Center at the University of Rhode Island, where she established the URI Partnership for Energy and Directed Energy Education Programs. Marion serves on the boards of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and the National Regulatory Research Institute, and is a member of the NARUC Committee on Electricity. She holds a PhD in Environmental Sciences from the University of Rhode Island, a BS from the University of Michigan, and an MS from Michigan State University. Thank you, Commissioner Gold, for joining us here today, and please take it away.
Well, thanks so much, Catherine, and thanks to everyone who helped organize this webinar on this super important topic. And I know it's a subject that we've spent a lot of time thinking about here in Rhode Island, years in the past and continuing in our most recent rate case of last year. So I'm really excited to have the chance to kick off the first in this four-part series. We are hoping that by the end of this series, we'll have some focused recommendations on best practices for the regulatory community. How can we move towards more consistent data collection and reporting models that we can use to monitor and improve delivery of energy services to our communities? And this is especially important as we are undergoing such rapid transformation in many of our utilities with the new technologies that are coming in. The webinar series, I should note, is building on a resolution that was adopted by Natsuko at their November 2018 annual meeting. The resolution, and I'm going to read it here, urges states to direct utilities to collect and post on the Public Utility Commission websites uniform time series statistical data on residential billings, collections, arrearages, and disconnections for non-payment. And I think the point here is that we've seen some increasing challenges in the area of disconnections and arrearages. You can't manage what you don't measure. So how can we work together to collect better data so that we can do better on this problem? Webinar follows up on this resolution by today we're going to lay out the problem we're facing. And I want to emphasize, as Catherine said, that this is setting the stage for future discussions. We welcome any and all questions, and we'll use the input that we get today to inform the rest of the series. So please chime in, send questions for our panelists, and also thoughts about future topics that we might consider. We have a great group of panelists with us today, and I'm going to introduce them very briefly with the note that their full bios will be posted on the NRRI website. We have Dr. Gabriela Sandoval, who is the Director of Strategic Initiatives with TURN, the Utility Reform Network. Originally an academic, Dr. Sandoval now applies her training to working with communities struggling to make ends meet, and she has some really terrific work on data collection. We have NAT Treadway, who is a managing partner with Distributed Energy Financial Group, LLC, at DEFG. He leads the Low Income Energy Issues Forum and supports DEFG's Prepay Energy Working Group. We have Roger Colton of Fisher, Sheehan and Colton, Public Finance and General Economics. Roger has been working to design, implement, and fund low-income affordability programs for over 40 years. And finally, we have Tyra Palusa, who works with the Connecticut Office of the Consumer Council. And Tyra comes to the Consumer Council with experience working on consumer issues from a real great diversity of perspectives. We've organized today's webinar in 3 parts. In the first part, we're going to try to describe the problem we're trying to solve. Shutoffs are on the rise, uncollectibles are growing, what's going on, and how will standardized data collection help address our problem. And that will be led by Tara and Gabriella. And then in part 2, we'll discuss some of the challenges and barriers that make the problem particularly vexing. This section will be led by Roger, with the other panelists chiming in. And then in part 3, we'll talk about some of the current initiatives, ideas that are being tested across the country to address the challenges. And Nat Treadway will lead this along with Roger and Gabriella and Tira, the other panelists. So again, please send questions to us as they occur to you. We'll pause after each section to see what questions have come in, and we'll also leave some time at the end to take your questions. So to kick things off, I'm going to turn it to Tyra Palusa from Connecticut.
Thank you, Commissioner Gold, for that introduction. It is a pleasure joining the other panelists today in sharing information that will help us all to better understand the impacts of shutoffs on ratepayers. In setting the stage for today's discussion, when I think about where we are in terms of delinquencies and disconnections, the first question that comes to my mind is why. Some of the factors that could be contributing include automation, the deployment of smart meters, the ease of disconnections, or the speed in which utilities could be performing the disconnections. Mergers and acquisitions, are there issues bridging billing systems? And of course, changes to customer situations, winter moratorium, hardship, and medically protected accounts. On the next slide, I show some other variables, such as the lack of standardized data collection and reporting from state to state, that can affect the rise of shutoffs. A few examples of data collected in Connecticut include accounts receivables with and without hardship information, the number of payment arrangements, and that includes the arrangements that have been met and those arrangements that have not been met, number of terminations, and also number of reconnects. So those are just a few examples. Another thought that comes to mind is whether there may be inconsistencies in terminology as well. And I listed here the uncollectible account in Connecticut would be defined as one where the balance has been written off or where the account is protected. Now, it may be unrealistic to expect to come away from the discussion today with a uniform data collection model, but instead gather general parameters to allow us to determine how to better evaluate credit and collection policies and to work toward establishing those best practices. On the next slide, I wanted to just lay out a few of the statistics that are contributing to the electric affordability problem specific to Connecticut. If you just look at the one figure here, in CL&P territory alone, shutoffs more than doubled from about 29,000 in 2015 to over 70,000 in 2018. And there's some statistics for the UI territory as well. And as a side note, in thinking about this, weather extremes can also cause utility costs to increase sharply and without warning, as we've seen in the recent years with a lot of the storms, and we've had a lot of storm recovery dockets here in Connecticut specifically. On the next slide In Connecticut, again, we've seen a rise in uncollectible accounts coded with protection, specifically medically protected accounts. Arrearages associated with these accounts continue to grow because payments are not being made, even though customers may have the financial means to pay. So there's not always a correlation between a hardship and a medical account. Those should be viewed separately. I also reference on the slide an open docket in Connecticut right now. It's docket 180425, and I included the number if anyone wanted to look at the information contained on the Bureau website. There's a lot of good information. It's been a collaborative process to date, consisting of a few technical meetings where the utility companies and also other interested stakeholders have been evaluating trends in program costs and participation. The next event associated with this docket is actually coming up next week, where the companies are due to make a filing specifically related to the medical certification process, as this is one of the areas where opportunities to reduce the impact of uncollectible accounts exists. On the next slide, again related to Connecticut, I pointed out a general statute related to the time period in which a pending termination notice could remain actionable, and both of the utilities raised this issue in that current uncollectibles docket. So I listed the statute and a link to that. The problem, as described by the companies, is that a new invoice restarts the company's dunning process and ends their ability to disconnect service until a new termination notice is generated. This typically adds about 14 business days before the companies can resume collection activity. So not necessarily a disconnect, but it restarts the collection activity clock. And this also is resulting in an increase to uncollectibles as past due balances age and grow. So again, these are just a few of the factors that could be playing a part in the rise of utility shutoffs that come to mind when I think about why we are where we are. And to get more into some of the insight as to the data collection across the various states, I'll turn it over to Dr. Gabriela Sandoval.
Thank you, Tyra, for setting the stage for this important conversation. When we at Turn launched our campaign to end shutoffs about 3 years ago, it became very clear that without accurate, standardized, accessible, and manipulable data, we could not measure and fully understand the magnitude of what is a crisis in utility affordability in California. And since launching that project, we've also come to recognize that this is, in reality, a national crisis in utility affordability. So better data would also make it possible for us to more accurately judge how different states fare in a comparative context. This is also important because in order to evaluate what policies and practices work or which work within which context, we need access to data that lends itself to comparison. The upshot is simply that we need better data if we want to understand energy insecurity within our states and across the country. So I want to share with you a little bit of data from California, if I could get the next slide. So even within a given state, and I'm using California here as an example, the 4 investor-owned utilities in California report data quarterly to the California PUC. They report data in different formats, which makes it difficult to fully understand the energy security landscape within the state. Now, this table shows some data that we were actually able to refine. We had to make very specific requests of the utility companies, but we were actually able to gather certain data points in a comparable format. This table shows how useful it can be to have multiple data points available that can be compared across utility companies. So by comparing disconnection notices, arrearages, shutoff numbers, and shutoff rates, and knowing as well the average total number of customers in each utility service territory, we were able to get a better sense of the larger energy insecurity landscape in the state. Now, one thing I want to point out from this table is that the numbers really hint at differences in IOU practices. So for example, while San Diego Gas and Electric has one of the lowest shutoff rates, they only conduct about 3 shutoffs for every 100 customers. Their customers carry arrears at a much higher rate than the other utilities. So SDG&E allows about 20% of their customers to be 60 plus days in arrears at any given moment, whereas PG&E and Edison, who are the other electric providers in the state, allow only about half of their customers to be in arrears for that long. If I can get the next slide. So how many states collect data on shutoffs? It would be fantastic to have access to more and better data across the country. There are quite a few barriers to this, and we'll look at some of those today. So 2 years ago, TURN worked to gather data from as many states as we could. With the help of Natsuko members, we were able to gather data from about 20 states. Now, a couple of things I want to note about the data that we gathered. All data were taken from reports filed with public service commissions and public utility commissions, as well as corporation commissions. And we were able to confirm that at least 14 states do not have any data available. Now, I didn't include the actual table with all of the data here or the names of particular states that do or do not have data, but all of that is available, and I'm happy to share with that if anyone is interested. Next slide. So the data we did receive were very difficult to compare. And so I just want to go over some of the issues we encountered. In some cases, data reported include involuntary and voluntary disconnections in the same number. Current data was not always available. We were looking for 2016 data for all states, and in some cases, data was only available for 2012, 2013. Some states only report data that is during the winter moratorium, and those moratoria may differ across states. Some states only report data during the months not covered by a moratorium. And so again, it's kind of inverse pictures of different states. And then there were some cases where data was only presented for certain parts of the year without any real logic as to why that was. Finally, some data reports included both residential and commercial accounts in aggregate form, making it very difficult to tease out the particularities of what is happening in households. On the next slide, I just wanted to share this image because while I don't want to put any one state on the spot, I do want to give you a sense of the range of data accessibility we encountered. While most reports came to us in PDF formats taken from Excel spreadsheets, there were quite a few states that sent scanned copies of hard copy reports. And then in at least one case, the reports were taken from handwritten documents like the one on this slide. So you can imagine how much more difficult this would make getting an accurate understanding of energy insecurity in Vermont if an advocate or researcher has to wade through 12 documents like this one in order to get a sense of one utility company's practices for a single year. Now, I know Roger will talk more about some of these challenges later in this webinar, so I won't go further into those here. On this next slide, I wanted to just share with you, as Commissioner Gold mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, Natsuko passed a resolution last November updating a previous resolution from 2011. Some of the critical points made in that resolution are on this slide. This is basically the list of data points that Natsuko felt was important to get a clear picture of energy security throughout the country. So these include data on total number of customers for utilities, disconnection numbers, reconnections as a function of time from disconnection, customers who are never reconnected. And this is a critical data point, especially in high housing cost areas like California, where we know that utility shutoffs are acting as a hidden driver of displacement. Payment plans and other forms of assistance, uncollectibles, arrears, and deposits. Now, the full text of the resolution is easily accessible on Natsuko's website, so I would encourage anyone interested to visit that website and take a look at the resolution. And on that note, I'll pass the baton to Roger Colton.
And let me just, this is Marion, Commissioner Gold. I just want to interject with one question that's come in. We've had a couple questions come in, but we're already a little short on time. There's clearly a lot to cover. And I want to thank you both. Those terrific presentations. One of the questions we got is, do any states collect data about utility costs associated with serving the medical needs accounts? The discussion makes me wonder whether there might be less expensive ways to ensure the very high reliability that medical needs customers might have. Any thoughts on that?
That data isn't regularly collected in California, but we are actually in the middle of a proceeding where we are making a data request of the utility companies to get a better sense of the cost of the medical program in California.
Got it. So something you're working on. And Tyra, how about in Connecticut? Any thoughts on how you're proceeding on that question?
I would have to look at the details in terms of Connecticut specifically.
Right, and that was another question that came in is, you know, why are the uncollectibles going up so dramatically? Is there a clear reason you can point to?
The one thing in Connecticut that I've heard from the utility companies in the uncollectibles docket is the increase in the protected accounts. That's been the main driver, that's been the focus of the recent discussions and the technical meetings. And I think the process has a lot to do with that, and the utilities' inability to challenge some of the protections. Also, the dichotomy again between a hardship and a medically coded. Just because you're medically coded doesn't necessarily mean that you have a financial hardship, and those two are being, unfortunately tied together. And so that's one of the things that they're looking at with the process in general.
Got it. That makes sense. Thank you so much. Okay, so now we'll turn to...
If I may poke my nose in there too, I've been involved in two different states, and one other problem that we found is the real spike in environmental expenditures. In one state, excuse me, I worked with the Attorney General's office, and we dealt with a natural gas company that was finally dealing with its gas repairs, and there was no question that they needed to repair their gas mains, and there was also no question that the cost of repairing their gas mains was going to drive rates and bills dramatically upward. And then in another state I worked in, there was a water company that was ordered to repair its water system, and ordered by the EPA. And they were forced to agree to spend $3 billion between now and the year 2030. So there are spikes in rates and bills going on in different service jurisdictions as well.
So it's just a matter of the overall costs are going up as we try to have a safe and reliable and clean energy system or water system.
And it's nobody questions that the costs are necessary or that the costs are reasonable, but that doesn't make the costs any lower.
Great. Well, thank you, Roger. And I guess that's a good lead into a discussion that you're going to lead on some of the other challenges and barriers that are making this problem particularly challenging.
Sure. There's an old saying that says that data is plentiful, information is less so, and understanding is even less so. So what we need to do is to avoid collecting data without having that data contribute to having us be smarter about what we're looking at and understanding the issues that we're seeking to understand. And the need for data, I would submit data collection, it really lies in two different places. One is that every utility is under an obligation to provide least cost service. The process of collecting their bills presents the same issue as a utility that has to decide whether to self-insure or to buy insurance policies. It presents the same issue as whether a utility is going to pay bank fees or maintain compensating bank balances. The question is how to bill and collect revenue in an effective and efficient way. And so what that does is it leads us to deciding what tools are in our toolkit, because the information that is available will tell us whether we want to engage in traditional collection activities, whether we want to provide discounts to income-challenged customers, whether we want to offer payment plans, whether we want to promote budget billing. And it is, I don't want to say that collecting uniform data is hopeless or is impossible, but I do want to say that collecting uniform data to inform those decisions is extraordinarily difficult, and it's far more difficult than many, or if not most people, realize. Let me go through just a couple. I was involved with a state where we were seeking to define what an arrearage is. Seems like a simple question. What's an unpaid bill? What's an arrearage? And then we realized the different utilities were defining it differently. That some utilities were saying that an unpaid balance that is currently subject to a deferred payment agreement on which the customer is current is still an unpaid balance, whereas other utilities were saying that if an arrearage was made subject to a deferred payment agreement, that bill was no longer an unpaid bill, and they took it out of their arrearage. One state that I worked in, actually was the same state, different utilities treated commitments by local LIHEAP agencies differently. Some utilities said that as soon as a local LIHEAP agency, LIHEAP being, of course, the Federal Fuel Assistance Program, that as soon as the local LIHEAP agency said, we're going to pay customer A $500, that money was booked, and or not booked, but that money was considered delivered, and the balance associated with that $500, whether or not the $500 was in hand, was no longer considered to be an arrearage. And other utilities said that until they actually received the money from the local agency, then the money was outstanding. The money was in arrearage. So defining something basic like an arrearage, defining a complete payment that seems like it should be a simple notion. But we found just a couple of weeks ago that different utilities were defining it differently. So if I often work, in fact, I tend to work with low-income folks. So if a low-income household, if a low-income customer received a LIHEAP payment, and most states, the LIHEAP payment comes as a single lump sum payment once a year, which then creates a bill credit that the customer draws down against. So in the months that the customer had a bill credit attributable to the LIHEAP payment, was the customer making a complete payment? I mean, the customer really paid nothing. They received a bill, but they paid nothing. And we found that some utilities were saying, yep, they received a bill and we didn't receive a payment from them, even though the bill had a bill credit on it. Other utilities just said, we're not going to consider that month at all. If there's a bill with a credit on it, then we just kick that out of the equation, whereas other utilities said that if there is a bill and there's a bill credit that's sufficient to cover the bill, that bill credit is considered to be a complete bill payment. Defining the age of arrears, we always talk about how old in arrears is. Is it 30 to 60, 60 to 90, 90 to 120, and so on and so forth? But there's really no agreement on how to define the age of arrears. In order to uniformly report data, you have to agree on what day one is. And we found in one state that some utilities define day one as the date that the bill was issued. We found other utilities that define day one as the date that the bill was due. And we found other utilities that define day one of an arrears as the date on which the next bill was issued. So somebody issues a bill, the bill is due on day 20, but the bill isn't considered to be 1 day in arrears. It doesn't go into the 1 to 30 day arrears bucket until the date of the next bill. One thing that let me turn to the definition of low income, and then I just want to make two last comments. People often say, utilities often say, rightfully so, that we can't report data on our low-income populations because we don't know who our low-income population is, and different utilities define who their low-income customers are differently. Some allow customers to self-declare income, such as in the negotiation of a deferred payment plan. Some utilities say, unless you receive LIHEAP, we're not going to count you as a low-income customer. Some utilities say, well, you can declare your income, but you need to have it verified by a community-based organization. So the definition of who a low-income customer is. And then the final point is, I don't mean to leave people as depressed, but it's extraordinarily difficult to get uniform definitions, is something that we just heard from California, particularly in the natural gas industry. It's difficult even to unbundle or unpack residential customers from non-residential customers, because many natural gas companies that I work with don't report residential and commercial customer classes. They have a small general service class, and unpacking that small general service class between residential and commercial is extraordinarily difficult. So our objective here and through the next several webinars is to come up with suggestions and resolutions to these problems. Thank you.
Great job, Roger. And I just have a question that came in just to further complicate. Do you have any information, or do any of the other panelists have information on data available to show how many customers are having trouble with a number of utilities, with electric, gas, and water, for example, and maybe even wastewater? We have.
Yes, there are a number of ways to do that, and I have a couple of recommendations, if I may offer them. One is that when you can look at disconnections, I think disconnections are not a good way, and we can talk about that later if people want to. I think a better way to look at payment troubles is by looking at arrearages. And what I've learned is that when you look at arrearages, you have to do a couple things. Number one is you have to look at both dollars of arrears, and you have to look at the numbers of accounts. So knowing that you've got $50 million in arrears is different depending on whether that represents 10,000 people or 50,000 people. So you need both the dollars and the numbers. And then I'm a firm believer in that one needs to do what the Bureau of Consumer Services in Pennsylvania developed, used a statistic called a bills behind statistic. The bills behind statistic says that if you have one person who is 200, or if you have two people who both of whom are $250 in arrears, those two people present very different risks. If one of them has an average monthly bill of $100 and the other has an average monthly bill of $50, because the first person is only 2 bills behind, whereas the second person is 5 bills behind. And the Bureau of Consumer Services developed this bills behind or weighted arrearage statistic that I think is very much underused in the utility industry.
Okay, I'd like to offer the opportunity to some of the other panelists to add to or respond to some of Roger's comments. Anyone want to chime in?
This is Nat Treadway, and I would just offer one supplement to the last, in response to the last question to what Roger provided. I know that some states, well, as everyone on the phone knows, probably every state deals with LIHEAP a little bit differently in terms of the state policies and the procedures that are used for those monies. Some states are ahead of other states, both in terms of moving toward a digital movement of information, as well as more centralization. So the question about are people behind on many bills at once, some states are doing a better job in terms of having more comprehensive, centralized look at all of that.
That's a very good point, Nat. And that was reminding me of a question I had for everyone is, are you seeing differences between, and I would assume you would be, large and small utilities in terms of both the challenges they're facing and their ability to collect and compile the data?
Well, the places where I work, the small utilities are often exempt from the reporting requirements. And what I've recommended is that whereas people need to have monthly data reported, that doesn't mean that the actual reporting has to occur on a monthly basis. So as utilities get smaller, it makes more and more sense to have those utilities provide monthly data, but to provide it on an annual basis or on a semi-annual basis, if people understand the distinction I'm making there.
This is Nat Treadway again. One comment I'd make about size is that while there are a number of smaller investor-owned utilities, when I start thinking about utility size, I start thinking about different types of utilities, of investor-owned versus public power or municipal utilities versus electric and cooperative arrangements. This, well, what Roger said is certainly true, that depending upon the state jurisdiction, the requirements on the smaller utilities and on the electric cooperatives and the municipal utilities are different or more light-handed in many states. Also, those smaller utilities are more in tune and in touch with their customers, and so that does a number of things. And by in tune with the customers, you know, electric co-ops have boards that are elected boards for co-ops and elected officials that oversee whatever board for municipal utility. So you have a more direct interaction between the problems and the people responsible for solving the problems, plus they're not-for-profit entities. And the other aspect of that is that the bad debt in many of those places is very unpopular, and if it's a small electric co-op or a small municipal utility, people really don't want to help pay their next-door neighbor's bill. They want that bill paid. And so there is some innovation that has occurred in the smaller utilities because of that closer connection between people that want the utility to collect the debt because they don't want their bills to go up by 1% or 2%.
And what Nat just said is particularly applicable to water utilities. The difference between small or even large unregulated municipal water and wastewater utilities and the regulated utilities, whether they be water, wastewater, or natural gas and electricity, is really dramatic. The unregulated municipal water and wastewater utilities are horrible at collecting information.
I have a question for Roger. Roger, based on the challenges of collecting data, do you think that the Natsuko Data Collection Resolution includes, you know, the right list of bullets? Maybe you can pull that slide up again.
I've attached that Natsuko resolution to any number of pieces of testimony of mine, because I think that it is a good thing. I think that the bullets on that list are good. If I were to critique that resolution, I would critique it in its failure to differentiate between numbers of accounts and dollars, such as accounts in arrears, the number of accounts in arrears versus the dollars in arrears. And you know, more than not collecting the information, I think we just need, as an industry, to be aware. Aware of differences. So if we see that Missouri is reporting some data, this data, and Iowa appears to be reporting the same data, we just need to make sure that we know what the similarities and differences are. So I had talked about data contributing to understanding, because if we don't understand the differences, then what we think we understand could well be wrong.
Right, that makes sense. All right, anyone else have anything to add on the challenges, or if not, we can turn towards some of the ideas that are being tossed around to get a handle on these problems?
This is NAT Treadway, and I would just offer on in terms of these resolutions and what we the beginning of this discussion, when we started the discussion about 20 or 30 minutes ago, there was discussion about medical accounts and some of the differences there. So I think that discussion leads us to the notion that as data has become digitized, and as we, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen a huge leap forward in terms of data that's available of different types. And we've been talking for quite a while about customer segmentation, that rather than speaking in a monolithic way about a low income or low to moderate income and people that have difficulty paying bills, that these data that as we decide what categories of data to collect, we should be thinking about the segments that are significant and that we need to focus on. And so there are many examples that could be given, but I would just, for example, say there are going to be some older people or people with disabilities that have low fixed incomes and don't live in a great a house that is in great shape. And so those are not needs that are going to be resolved quickly. There are the medical issues that are significant and not be resolved quickly. But there are a lot of people struggling to pay their bills, or low to moderate income people struggling to pay their bills, that we should be able to find new ways, and we're going to get into this discussion, but find new ways for utilities to interact with them. Many of them really do want to keep their power or their gas running. They do want to pay their bills. They do want to get caught up on their arrears and so forth. But the way that we regulate is, I believe, a little out of date, and we need changes in what we're doing so that they will be able to do that. So I think thinking about segments and the segments where we need to collect data and be monitoring over time, and agreeing to basic definitions. Obviously, Roger and others have given this a great deal of thought, and we need to go in that direction. And then in the tables, have the column for the asterisks and the notes, as Roger just said, to explain where it's pretty close to the data from this state. It's pretty close to the definition, but the note will explain to people so we have a heads up as to why they collect it in a different way, and so we don't misuse it.
That's an excellent suggestion. I like that. Thank you, Nat.
I think more and more states, to build on what Nat just said, more and more states are trying to segment their and if we can agree to talk about residential customers, but segment the residential customer population, not simply by payment patterns, whether somebody is in short-term arrears or long-term arrears, whether they're in frequent arrears or occasional arrears, and so on and so forth, but by demographics. And I know that states like Pennsylvania have developed, excuse me, a definition of confirmed low-income customer. Now, we haven't all agreed on what that definition is at this point, but the PUC's definition is a person or a customer is a confirmed low-income customer if the utility has information that reasonably makes it appear that the customer is low income. And again, that information may come in the negotiation of a payment plan. It may come because somebody is a LIHEAP recipient. But more and more states that I work with are trying to crack the nut of how do you define who a low-income customer is? Because otherwise utilities, quite rightly, say we have no idea of who our low-income folks are. And we all know that using the receipt of LIHEAP is not an adequate definition because LIHEAP serves less than 20% of the eligible population. So that's one initiative that is going on. Another definition or another initiative I think that I've been working on more and more. I'm doing a couple cases now in Illinois where we're looking at budget billing. So the question of long-term arrears isn't the issue, and the customers who are 90 plus days or 120 plus days, those aren't the customers that that would benefit from budget billing. But if you look at the customers who are 1 to 30 days in arrears or 31 to 60 days in arrears, and you can simply graph the number of accounts by aging bucket and the dollars of accounts by aging buckets, and you can see how the seasonal variation in dollars is dramatically different from the seasonal variation in accounts. And you can identify the people who say, we want those folks who get into arrears during the cold or into the high cost month, cold for gas, heat for electricity, but who get out of arrears in the lower cost months. we want those folks on budget billing, and that will address disconnects, that will address working capital, it will address a whole bunch, that's a term of art, a whole bunch of the problems that we deal with.
I like the term of art, Roger.
Sorry.
And that reminds me of how much of this, and you actually were part of our rate case recently, and you did some excellent data analysis that helped us all get a better understanding of the challenges that we were facing. And I think some of this just means there's some hard work that has to be done, with each utility in each state, no matter how we do with getting better data for nationwide work. I want to encourage folks, if they have any questions for this great group of experts that we have here, to send them in. And now, Nat, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the ideas you have or you have seen for addressing these challenges going forward?
Sure. So I alluded to segmentation a minute ago, and I guess go ahead and bring up the one slide. So I just pulled one slide up to share with everyone. There's a lot on this slide, so let me talk about it for a few minutes. And it's just to get us thinking about some issues in a little bit different way. But so I talked about segmentation. We know that in our complex lives, particularly in our relationship with that magical device that we've been carrying in our pockets for roughly 10 years now, that a lot is changing. Our expectations as consumers are changing. What we can do changes. How we like to do things changes. So there's a tremendous interaction between technology and preferences and what happens in our marketplaces and so forth. DEFG does a number of annual surveys each year. One of them I do through the Low Income Energy Issues Forum, and that's a survey of consumers that earn less than $50,000 a year. We use Russell Research. They have it's an online survey. They have a panel and they do the statistics for us and so forth. This chart is not from that annual survey. This chart is from a different annual survey that we do, and this is without regard to income. So as you can see in that first column there, it says 1,062 people. So this is a random survey of 1,000 households throughout the United States. And this particular chart comes from a question that was in a bundle of questions related to prepaid energy service. And so these customers randomly selected throughout the U.S., so didn't have prepayment, but we asked them, as many of you may have been reading ahead while I'm talking, but this is a fairly complex question, but we tried to ask it in a straightforward manner to basically say, and it's worth reading, if you knew that your local utility turned off your service and then restore your electric service within minutes on your schedule, could do so without penalty or any fee, would you ever consider self-disconnection? Example, let your account run to zero balance so that service is turned off temporarily to conserve energy away for a weekend or as a reminder to put money in your account, and then reconnecting at your convenience. So a lot bundled up in that, but in that first column, you can see that the way that was phrased, the way it was asked, that basically in the lowest block, the darkest blue, about a third of the people said, yeah, I'd consider that. And about a third of the people right above that said, no, I wouldn't consider that. And then about a quarter said it depends, and about 10% said, basically, I don't know what you're talking about. Probably thought it was a confusing question. The point is that we have in the industry for a century thought about reliability and always-on service as just a given that is without question, just an absolute. And we think that it's worth exploring all sorts of different options that allow customers to take utility service in different ways and think differently about, possibly think differently about how they want to manage their lives and how they want to interact with utilities. So this particular question about, would you ever consider letting your power go off if you could turn it back on within a few moments, is one thing that is a little different. You can see there's differences there men versus women, younger versus older people in particular, pretty strong differences. Household, wealthier people would like it more, above median income people like it more than lower income people, and so forth. This is on our website. If you want to download the whole survey, a whole bunch of, under publications, there are a whole bunch of surveys that we've done over the past decade, dozens of them there that you can download. This one was January 2017. I throw that out there just to start the conversation. There are other dimensions of things that can be done a little bit differently, but I wanted to put that out there as a discussion point and let the others react to it.
Well, I don't want to put you on the spot, Roger, but I'd love to hear your reactions to this idea, and also our panelists from Connecticut and California. Is this something that's been considered, is under discussion in your?
Well, let me not address the specifics of this chart, but rather the broader issue from the issue of data collection. Data collection is helpful. Indeed, I would almost go so far as to say most helpful when it's used to segment the customer base. I think that one of the reasons that we're seeing the increase in payment troubles that we're seeing today is that there is, I'm going to get in trouble here, but there is a generation of folks who has been raised on what I will call traditional collection mechanisms. If somebody gets behind, the way to respond is to send a disconnect notice and to put them into the collection process. And we now know that that's not the case. And different kinds of customers with different payment patterns require different approaches to responding to non-payment. It's cliche, but it's nonetheless true. The old adage that when your only tool is a hammer, you see every problem as a nail. And we need to, as Nat was saying, which I agree with 1,000%, that we need to start segmenting our customer bases to decide, okay, who needs a discount? Who needs to be put on budget billing? Who needs to be put on a deferred payment plan? Who has unpaid balances that we can address through a targeted energy efficiency program? And we can't engage in that segmentation unless we collect data. And we can't engage in that segmentation unless and until we get past the notion that we have to treat everybody the same. And that's where I might get in trouble, because some people may say that's just wrong. You have to treat everybody the same, and I don't believe that. I don't want to jump in if the others wanted to speak, but I wanted to support the way Roger phrased that. Would one of the other panelists like to speak first?
This is Tyra from Connecticut. I will definitely agree with the segmentation and agree with everything that Roger was speaking to, and the information, Nat, that you provided is very interesting. I don't know that this has been considered in Connecticut. It's not, the idea is not familiar to me, but it's something that I'll definitely try to bring to the table and get feedback on.
And I will just jump in. This is Marion from Rhode Island. It's the moderator. Maybe I shouldn't be jumping in, but I think that this question of customer segmentation is something that we are all thinking about. It definitely requires an investment. I think it requires an investment in smart meter technology or some kind of technology that allows better access to data, which is another big investment. So if you add that investment, and I know many places across the country have already made that investment, but it becomes another capital cost that you have to add to all the other capital costs that we're dealing with. deciding if the benefits justify the costs.
So I'll jump back in. Two things. One is Roger said may get in trouble, but maybe we shouldn't treat people equally. Let me first, as a disclaimer, say I don't know Roger well. We don't interact every day, and so we didn't plan what he was going to say and how he was going to respond to it. So this is not staged. But for a number of years, I've been trying to have people, as we work on low income and how we have programs to try to solve the low income issue, the affordability issue. And I've been trying to explain to people that programs are great, but if there are systemic or systematic issues or problems that we should resolve that lead to a better outcome, we should do those. Because in other words, put the solution in place and then see what programs are needed. So for example, I've said before, very low income, elderly people, disabled people, medical issues. You can't just magically create a system that makes somebody young or makes them employed again, or so forth. So there will be programs needed to address particular needs. But I also said that a lot of people that struggle to pay, and we're talking 20 to 30% of the customers, as we saw in some of the charts earlier, a lot of the people simply do want to pay, but face issues that they can't. And the way that I describe it now is that I believe, and this may get me in trouble, but it's fine because I've had it in a couple of years now. I've been putting a couple of charts on this in panel presentations. When you think about designing a tariff for a class of customers, and it's all of your residential customers, and they take the tariff, the R1 tariff, or whatever you call it in your jurisdiction. And I'm oversimplifying. I understand that many jurisdictions have a variation on it, could be a time of use variation or whatever. But basically, in that process of determining the revenue requirement and then allocating revenues to classes and then developing rates or rate design that fairly recovers, allows the utility to earn a reasonable rate of return on recovery of their revenue. That if you end up with basically a standard residential tariff, you have aimed a tariff and you've done a great job. Congratulations, you've done a great job. You developed a great tariff for your median customer, your median income customer. The two problems with that: wealthy customers don't get good service, and people that struggle to pay don't get good service. Let's talk about the wealthy people first. They go buy stuff. They don't get what they need from their natural gas utility, their water utility, or their electric utility. So they go out and buy the stuff that they need. The remote controlled curtain windows that go up and down and lower the lights, and the special, all the stuff that you can get at Best Buy or beyond Best Buy. If you're wealthy, you meet your energy service needs that aren't provided by your utility by buying stuff. On the other side, I would say that just as poorly served as wealthy people are people that struggle to pay their bill. You're basically delivering to them and requiring that they pay for what you've determined is median service. And maybe they need options from that that are different from that. Maybe if they were given a choice, they would buy different services. So that's one comment. The other half of the comment deals with segmentation. So I think we know what we're talking about when we talk segmentation. The utilities are trying to collect more data, but beyond segmentation is what people refer to as customization or individualization. In the same way that if you were to take my cell phone, my mobile phone, and look at the apps that I have and how I use it, it's very different than even somebody that looks a whole lot like me that has the same phone. We interact with it differently. We do different things. That other person has apps on it that I've never heard of and I don't know how to use and I'm not interested in. So that's very, very, very different. That's almost the opposite of utility service, in which one tariff serves everybody. So I think utilities can begin to think about more individualization in terms of things that people opt into. Now, I don't mean that this is a brand new idea. A lot of this already happens. You have 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 different ways that you can pay your monthly utility bill. You have different types of communication you can opt into or not. You can go to the website and look at your hourly usage if they have smart meters. And in fact, 1 to 2% of people actually do that. And probably most of them don't ever go back again because it's not very interesting information. So there are a lot of ways way beyond those types of individualization or customization. There are a lot of ways that you could offer other ways that people could choose to interact with you, choose to pay, choose the type of service that they want. And a lot of what we do is trying to help utilities understand what those options are, particularly as leveraged by the advanced meters, and then work on that. So rather than get into esoteric examples or things you haven't heard of, and we don't have a presentation for you to see on those things, I'm talking really, really basic changes. So for example, it is just a given that you send out a monthly bill. Why monthly? Many people don't get paid monthly. In the new gig economy where people have 2 or 3 part-time jobs, they get paid when they get paid. And saving up for the monthly bill in really hot or cold weather is really hard. So the monthly bill in itself is well designed to have a good portion of your residential customer fail. You couldn't come up with a better way to make them fail, except maybe double rates, right? I think there are a lot of things that have just been the same forever. And in the days when we mailed out a bill and they wrote a check and put a stamp on it and mailed it back in, they made a lot of sense. But we're not in the 1970s or 80s anymore. And we can begin to think beyond that and change the way we interact with people. Monthly, not just the timing of it, it may not match up with when they get paid, but also how hard is it or easy is it for them to pay frequently? Many of you may know that the Southern Company, which is Georgia Power and a couple of other affiliates in the Southeast U.S., they have a barcode, for example, on the bill, which you can either take the paper bill or you can put that barcode on your phone, and you can walk into many grocery stores and convenience stores. They can scan the barcode and you can pay $50. So if you know a big bill is coming, you can make a payment ahead of time if you happen to have money today. So we think that there are huge opportunities for just completely rethinking the way we've been doing business for a century, and make it and target low-income customers and their lifestyles and needs and preferences, and let them choose the best way for them. Most of them want to pay. Most of them want to keep the service on all the time. Most of them want to pay back all of their arrearages if they are in arrears. I'll pause there.
So that's very thought-provoking, Nat. This is Marion. And usually the kinds of things you're talking about, I hear raised looking at a different market segment, consumers who might be interested in renewable energy or some kind of whiz-bang energy management system, as opposed to using it as a tool to help people, to help make energy bills more affordable. So I think it's quite an intriguing conversation. And do you think, is this something that utilities would put forth to the regulators, and then we would mull over the pros and cons, the benefits and the costs? Is that how you see it emerging? Would it be come from third-party suppliers in unregulated markets like Texas or New England?
You asked a lot there. Yes, I think it will come forth in, yes, no, I think that our utility clients are taking some of these ideas to their regulatory commissions and getting approvals. I'm on this phone because I think this serves our clients for me to raise awareness with commissioners and commission staff. A little over a month ago, I presented a survey to invited commissioners and commission staff to see I presented some information from 5 annual surveys, pulled out what I thought were interesting slides about low-income customers. That presentation deck is available, and I'd be glad to send it to anybody. People can have a fairly unique name, so I'm pretty easy to find on the internet, even without typing a DEFG. But I'd be glad to send that to anybody that would like. So yes, getting the conversation going and getting people to allow utilities to take some chances and try some new things. Immediately that leads to a discussion of pilot programs. I'm not against pilot programs, and as a realist, I know that pilot programs are the way to go. But frankly, I'm not enthusiastic about pilot programs. I would rather a program just be started. And of course, you start slow and build. But if it works and people opt into it, go for it and let the utility go for it. So we shouldn't be wasting time on a pilot program and then a year to analyze the results, in my opinion. Now, that's not an absolute. And I also understand that there are many statutory constraints, but I'm talking about statutory changes as well as rule changes at the regulatory commissions, as well as changes in the practices that utilities follow. I think there can be dramatic changes pretty quickly if people put their mind to it. You also asked about different states. I am a Texan. I did work the PUC of Texas from 1985 to 99, so I was involved in the last 4 years with the structure of the Texas market. I would briefly, because it's its whole series of presentations, explain to people that the restructured Texas market is entirely different unto its own and separate from the restructuring that has occurred in about 14 other states in which you can opt for your power supply. I don't believe that any state is really too eager to adopt the Texas model, but I would not try to answer a question about how things work in Texas versus how they might work in a state where you can choose your power supplier. As an old energy efficiency advocate, because that's what I filed testimony on from 85 to 95 in Texas, I'd say that to me it's all about the value derived from the end use device, and the commodity is simply one input into that device. So it's one input of your package of energy services or package of services of desirable things that you value. If you approach everything from a commodity perspective, I think you're largely, you will fail, I believe. And I believe that's why we're failing, that people have too much of a commodity mindset. We still bill on kilowatt hours. I think there are a lot of more creative ways to bill than on kilowatt hours, for example.
Okay, a question has come in that it's a little bit related. It's not as radical as the ideas you're talking about, but it states maybe at some appropriate time we could talk about partial service shutoffs. Could we possibly divide our utility uses into 2 or 3 categories, such as critical uses versus not so critical versus, I would like that, and then maybe able to shut off non-critical uses while leaving the critical service in place. For example, aren't there lots of places where people put quarters into a slot to have hot water for a shower? So that's a more limited approach, but any thoughts on that?
Yes, if I may respond to that. We tried, I'm not sure who the we is. The folks in Pennsylvania tried something not exactly like that, but probably 25 or 30 years ago, tried to define essential uses, and we found that defining essential uses was made it ultimately a non-starter, because what is an essential use to one household is not an essential use to another household, and there is information that I don't think it's available for all 50 states, but it provides data that would be helpful for folks to understand. And the data looks at what are called self-sufficiency incomes. And it is not the income that is important. It is the way that households are divvied up. And it looks at what people use. So if you have 3 households and they all have 3 people in it, it depends, what is an essential use depends on whether those 3 different households with 3 people each are 2 adults and a teenager, one adult, a school-age kid, and an infant, one adult, a school-age kid, and a teenager. There are just so many factors that go in to defining quote unquote essential use that it becomes unworkable. I think that segmentation, instead of approaching segmentation that way, segmentation can be helpful in helping a utility and helping regulators and advocates to decide how to respond to non-payment. So if you have a customer and you can look at your databases, and looking at the customer information systems should be seen as looking at a database rather than looking at an accounting system. But you can look at your customer information system and see, okay, does this person consistently go into arrears during the high cost months and then pay their way out of it during the lower cost months? Well, that person needs to be treated differently than somebody who hasn't made a payment for the last 8 months. Do we have a customer that has never missed a payment in the last 15 years and all of a sudden has missed 3 in a row? That person deserves something other than a shutoff notice. So that's what I look at when I think of customer segmentation, looking at informing the utility response to non-payment.
Just making a note of that. That's a good point. Dr. Sandoval, do you have any comments on this conversation from your vantage point in California, where you've been looking at data, trying to figure out how to best help customers make their bills sustainable?
Yes, we currently in California have 2 open proceedings, one looking at affordability, which would maybe go back to an earlier question about looking at utilities more holistically. So in that proceeding, we are trying to arrive at some affordability metrics that would take into account electricity, gas, water, and telecom services. Now, whether or not we'll be successful remains to be seen. It's a lot, and there are lots of different parties with lots at stake. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. In the other proceeding that I mentioned, which is the Disconnections proceeding, which is an attempt to actually reduce the number of disconnections. And I have to say, California has, similarly to Connecticut, seen a very large uptick in shutoffs in the last, not in the last 2 or 3 years, but definitely in the last 10 years. Disconnections have almost doubled in the state. And so we are working with the PUC to address the disconnections. And we have talked about the use of service limiters, which make it possible to provide a small baseline amount throughout the month for households. Now, whether or not that will be something that is considered more fully remains to be seen. But I think it goes back to the question that Roger raised about what is essential service, at what threshold would we set something like that? It does very much complicate the conversation. So currently, at least at Turn, we are focusing on different types of fixes, but that is definitely a conversation that we're interested in engaging in, this idea that we could somehow provide a certain amount of partial service that remains universal and consistent throughout the month, which also would address some of the concerns that we have had with other systems like prepayment, where people experience multiple shutoffs throughout the course of a month. This might be a way to get around some of those issues.
Excellent, thank you. That's very helpful. Any other questions or comments from the panelists? Then I would like to just summarize a little bit and talk about some of the ideas that we had for future webinar series, if not. Okay, we're just looking at a question that came in. So I think we have some themes that have emerged. Delinquencies and terminations are growing across the country, and we've looked at very specific data from, or heard specifically from Connecticut and California. We're certainly seeing it here on the East Coast, and it sounds like the problem is occurring across the nation. Some of the better data could help us compare what's going on within states and between states. The data that has been collected in California does reveal differences in practices between utilities that we might be able to learn from. And it would be fantastic if we could have data collected from more states. And I'll just say that I know that NRRI is standing by, willing to work with us on follow-up issues. So perhaps continuing to survey states and find out what kinds of data are being collected and work towards some consistency might be something that NRI could assist with. And then Roger pointed out that part of the problem is just that the costs are going up because of a variety of factors related to various environmental considerations. So we're seeing that infrastructure costs are growing, and that is certainly true in all of the segments: gas, electricity, and certainly water. Roger also pointed out that collecting uniform data to inform decisions is much more difficult than most of us realize. Not to say that we shouldn't continue to work toward that, but it will be challenging, and it will be important to note when looking at the data that there are differences in how states define certain things. We have to be aware that the terminology will differ. And then we had a really excellent and thought-provoking conversation on improving our ability to understand market segments, the different challenges that each of the market segments face, and then how we might be able to best serve those market segments as consumer expectations are changing, technology is changing, and we are having a growing problem with terminations and delinquencies. And then we had the comment that data collection is most useful when it's used to segment the customer base and then help utilities, regulators, and advocates decide how we can use that information to best serve individual customers. And then getting into ideas that I like the idea that California, it sounds very challenging, is looking to see whether the whole problem of utility payments can be looked at more holistically. And another one of our participants had suggested that perhaps utilities could integrate their programs, affordability with efficiency, with renewable energy programs across the board to better serve consumers. Anything that anyone would like to add to that broad overview? So if not, I actually have one last question. I wonder if any of our panelists are aware of states that have set up performance metrics for utility low-income programs. And if so, are the metrics used for tracking purposes or have incentives and penalties been included? Roger, are you familiar with that?
I don't know of anybody that has performance incentives unique to low-income folks, but that may say more about what I know than whether there are such incentives.
Right.
I know, no, I don't know, but that
and I will
comes with the disclaimer.
Yeah, and in Rhode Island, based on our last rate case, we decided that we needed to collect better data as a start. So we're tracking a number of metrics with the idea that eventually perhaps we could tie either penalties or incentives. to improve performance?
Metrics on low-income programs is of great interest, I think, to the utilities we work with. I mentioned the Low-Income Energy Issues Forum. That's about a 6-year-old effort, and about 2 years ago we created an online database, and we're expanding that. And the database is intended to bring in the kind of the cross-pollination and the reintegration or integration in different ways of all the ways that a utility touches or interacts with, broadly stated, the services for low-income customers. So yes, energy assistance programs, and yes, of course, energy efficiency programs, but then all the other ones, even the ones that you don't normally think of as a program per se, so the payment arrangements, the budget billing, the policies that you have on arrearages, and so forth. Basically, every way that you interact with that low-income customer, look at that across and how other utilities are doing it to see if there are best practices. There are, for example, there are energy assistance programs that have certain pieces that are required and they're tied to. In other words, you must be on PIP, a percentage of income payment plan, or you must be on budget billing, or you must. And I'm kind of asking utilities to question the must be on versus the what works for that customer. So what mix would customers want to drive it so they get the package of services that best serves them. And I mentioned the low-income program database because it definitely, we're building it out, but it definitely has a metrics component that is people are very, very interested in. They're interested in looking at these basic ratios and measures across their programs versus other utilities programs.
Excellent, excellent. Well, that is actually the first idea on ideas for future surveys, was to explore how payment challenges are considered within the overall context of a suite of related utility programs: affordability, efficiency, financial assistance for bill payments, housing standards, landlord-tenant issues. Are there examples where progress has been made in coordinating services and reducing problems, and could these programs serve as models for others? So maybe a session, drilling down into some of the things that have been tried. And I'll just we're starting to run very short on time. A second idea was, how might utility financing practices help even very low or moderate income customers achieve large savings across all utilities through offering no money down and longer term paybacks? And Tom Stanton from NRRI is working on a paper on that subject, so that's an intriguing idea. And again, some of these ideas touch on what you were throwing out, Nat. And then another idea is to spend more time looking at your work in identifying different kinds of market segments among those who face serious financial difficulties, and maybe there would be value in sharing some more of that research in a future webinar, perhaps coupled with some of the work that's going on in California. And then the final thought was whether there's a role for utilities in helping customers to prevent and avoid crisis situations that may occur after an energy or a water emergency. So kind of taking this discussion of affordability and delinquency and thinking about it in terms of crisis management, which is a big issue. Any other final thoughts in the last, we have 30 seconds, last 30 seconds. And if not, since we have so much, we don't have much time, I just want to extend our thanks to the panelists for a very lively discussion. I also want to thank the staff from NRRI and Charlene Ketchum from NARUC's Committee on Consumers and the Public Interest, and the team at Natsuko for their work to join forces to address this important issue. And I think this has been a good kickoff conversation, and I'm looking forward to the next 3 webinars in the series. Any final comments from NRRI?
Yes, thank you so much for hosting today, Commissioner Gold, or moderating. Really, before we leave today, thank you for everyone for sticking around for so long. Our next webinar on this topic, part 2, will be on Monday, June 10th, at the same time, and it's going to continue this conversation. So we're going to dive into more of these topics. If you're interested in finding out more information on this webinar and how to register for the next webinar or any of the NRI's research, please go to www.nrri.org. So I think with that, we can end today's webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.